Sophia Hart had never broken a single rule in 10 years of running a billion-dollar empire. Not one clause in a contract. Not one promise made in a boardroom. Not one boundary she had drawn around the life she built with her own two hands. She was the kind of woman who arrived at meetings 5 minutes early and left them with every objective already accomplished. She was precise, the way a surgeon is precise, not because she lacked feeling, but because she had long ago decided that feeling things too deeply was the most expensive mistake a person could make. And yet, on a Tuesday evening in late October, standing in the marble foyer of the most exclusive private dining club in the city, Sophia Hart was about to do something she had never done before. She was about to ask a complete stranger to lie for her. The most powerful woman in the city was preparing to propose the strangest deal of a man's life. No love, no attachment, no future, just a signature on a contract, and 6 months of pretending. She believed she was in complete control. He believed the same thing about himself. They were both wrong, and neither of them would understand just how wrong until it was far, far too late. Sophia Hart turned 36 in the same boardroom where she had signed her first acquisition at 26. She did not celebrate. She scheduled a strategy review instead, ordered black coffee, and spent the morning dismantling a mid-sized logistics firm that had underestimated her. That was simply who she was, Hart Global's CEO, sole inheritor of her father's empire, and by every measurable standard, one of the most formidable executives in the country. Her father, William Hart, had built the company from a regional shipping business into an international conglomerate. And when he retired, he handed the reins to his only daughter, without hesitation. What he did not hand her, and what no one had ever successfully given her, was peace. Sophia had been beautiful and brilliant for as long as she could remember. And for just as long, people had tried to use both things against her. There had been a man at 24, charming, attentive, the kind of man who remembered the name of the wine she liked, who turned out to have been cultivating her for 18 months, simply to gain access to her father's distribution network. There had been another at 29, a colleague she genuinely respected, who proposed marriage 3 weeks after learning she was restructuring the company's equity. She had ended both relationships without drama and without tears. And somewhere in the clean, quiet aftermath of each ending, she had made herself a promise. No more. Not love, not attachment, not the specific vulnerability that came with allowing another person inside the walls she had built. She was not bitter, she was simply careful. She wore her detachment the way she wore her tailored suits, as armor, as presentation, as a declaration of exactly who she was and what she would and would not tolerate. And for years, it worked perfectly, until the board began to see her composure not as strength, but as liability. The trouble had been building for months before it finally broke open at a quarterly gala hosted by one of the company's oldest investors, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who wore pocket squares and clung to the belief that a CEO's personal life was a direct reflection of her professional stability. Sophia arrived alone, as she always did, in a midnight blue dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and within 20 minutes of entering the room, she was cornered by a circle of men twice her age, who wore their wealth like a second skin and their assumptions like a birthright. One of them, a senior shareholder named Douglas Fenn, had positioned himself beside her at the bar and delivered his remarks with the practiced casualness of a man who never said anything without having calculated its effect first. He had mentioned, almost in passing, that the board's upcoming vote on Hart Global's Pacific expansion would require the full confidence of every stakeholder involved. He had mentioned, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, that confidence was something built not just in the numbers, but in the narrative. And then he had looked at her, alone at a bar at 45 minutes past 9, and said, "A woman in your position, Sophia Stability, sends a message." She had held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, smiled with equal calculation, and walked away. But inside, something had shifted. She had spent the drive home running figures in her head, weighing the political cost of Fenn's influence against the practical reality of what he was threatening, and by the time the elevator opened onto her penthouse floor, she had arrived at a conclusion she found simultaneously elegant and absurd. She needed a fiancé. Not a real one. Just a convincing one. Just long enough for the vote to pass, the expansion to launch, and the board to redirect its anxieties somewhere else. 6 months, she calculated. 6 months of strategic theater, and then back to the life she had built and preferred. All she needed was the right person to play the role. Ethan Cole did not think of himself as someone who needed rescuing. He was 40 years old, 6 feet of quiet competence, and had survived enough difficulty to know the difference between a problem with a solution and a situation that simply required endurance. He had been a talented architect, once the kind whose name appeared in design publications, whose early projects had won awards in cities he was still young enough to be excited about visiting. That version of himself felt like someone from a book he'd read a long time ago. The marriage to Claire had begun with genuine love and ended, after 9 years, in a dissolution so civil it was almost eerie. They had been polite to each other through the separation, methodical about the division of assets, and equally devoted to the single point on which they agreed completely. Their daughter, Lily, came first, always. Lily was 11 now, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn habit of building things with her hands, and she was currently living with Claire in Portland while undergoing treatment for a rare kidney condition that had been diagnosed 2 years earlier. The treatment was working, slowly and expensively, and every month Ethan transferred whatever he could spare into the account that covered Lily's medical costs. It was never enough, and it was always everything he had. He had given up his architecture firm after the divorce, when the financial pressure of splitting a household and starting over had made the overhead of running his own practice impossible. He had taken on freelance work, then construction consulting, then a part-time drafting position at a firm that paid him a fraction of what his talent was worth, because he needed the stability of a regular paycheck more than he needed the satisfaction of creative work. He did not complain about this. He woke up every morning and made the coffee and went to wherever he needed to be. And he did what needed to be done, because Lily needed the treatment, and the treatment needed the money, and the money required him to keep moving. He was honest and responsible and quietly, persistently exhausted. Then came the morning in November, when a new invoice arrived from the hospital in Portland, a notification about an additional specialist, a new phase of treatment that would require a procedure Ethan had not budgeted for, could not budget for, had no realistic path to budgeting for in the time available. He sat at his kitchen table with the invoice on his phone and a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and for the first time in 2 years, he felt the specific despair of a man who has given everything he has and is being asked to give more. He was still sitting there, calculating and recalculating numbers that refused to cooperate, when his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was polished and efficient. The voice of someone accustomed to arranging things. "Mr. Cole," it said, "there's a CEO who would like to meet with you, tomorrow morning if possible." Her name is Sophia Hart. Ethan arrived at the Hart Global building the next morning in the best jacket he owned, which was a charcoal wool blazer he'd bought 3 years ago for a friend's wedding and had dry cleaned exactly once since. He had expected a large office, which he got. He had expected someone important, which he also got. He had not expected the particular quality of Sophia Hart's stillness, the way she sat behind her desk, like a woman who had already decided everything and was now simply waiting for the room to catch up. She looked at him the way a person looks at a contract before signing it, assessing, thorough, without the performance of friendliness. She was striking, in the way that precision is striking every detail exactly as intended, nothing accidental. She asked him to sit, and he sat, and she told him, without preamble or apology, exactly what she wanted. 6 months. Public appearances. Company events. Media visibility. The role of her fiancé played convincingly enough to satisfy a board of directors and a cluster of conservative shareholders who had made her personal life their professional concern. In exchange, she named a figure that made him go very still in his chair. It was more than he earned in 2 years. It was, he calculated in the seconds before he could stop himself from calculating, enough to cover Lily's treatment costs completely, with enough left over to retire the debts that had accumulated like sediment over the last 3 years of his life. She slid a document across the desk. It was already printed, already organized into numbered clauses, as if she had anticipated every question he might have and answered it in advance. No romantic involvement, no interference in each other's private lives, no extension beyond the agreed period. A clean arrangement, she said, between two adults who understood what they were agreeing to. Ethan read the document twice. He looked at the figure again. He thought about Lily, about the invoice on his phone, about the specific helplessness of being a man who wanted to do right by his daughter and kept running out of road. He thought about how this was, objectively, a strange thing to agree to. He thought about how the woman across the desk from him radiated the kind of certainty that made strange things feel manageable. He picked up the pen. He signed his name. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in a place he wasn't yet paying attention to, something shifted very slightly, as though a gear had turned that was not supposed to turn. The penthouse on the 52nd floor was not what Ethan would have chosen for himself, which was perhaps the understatement of his life so far. His apartment had been a two-bedroom in a decent neighborhood. With a kitchen, he'd renovated himself, and bookshelves he'd built from reclaimed oak, and it had suited him exactly because it reflected the choices he had made and the life he had assembled from those choices. The penthouse reflected Sophia Hart immaculate, expensive, deliberately sparse in the way that only truly wealthy spaces are sparse, where the absence of clutter is not economy but curatorship. He was given a guest suite with a bed that probably cost more than his car and a view of the city at night that was, he had to admit, genuinely extraordinary. He was briefed on the social calendar, introduced to the relevant members of staff, and handed a schedule of upcoming events that read like a semester course in elite performance. There were dinners with board members, a charity gala, a media appearance for a Hart Global press announcement, and a weekend trip to the company's retreat in the mountains, where 20 senior executives would spend 48 hours discussing strategy while pretending to relax. He would need appropriate clothing. He would need to know which fork to use. He would need to look, at all times and in all circumstances, like a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. He was willing to learn, but he was less willing to pretend to be someone he wasn't. This, as it turned out, was the first thing that genuinely surprised Sophia Hart. She was accustomed to people shape-shifting around her, adjusting their posture, their vocabulary, their apparent opinions based on what they perceived she wanted from them. Ethan Cole did not do this. He sat across from her at dinner on their third evening together and told her, with the matter-of-fact directness of a man who had long ago stopped caring about whether candor was fashionable, that her approach to managing the board sounded reactive rather than strategic. She looked at him with an expression that could have been outrage or curiosity, and he held her gaze without flinching. And something in that moment, the quality of his steadiness, the absence of performance, made her pause in a way she hadn't expected. He wasn't afraid of her. She had forgotten what that felt like. Their differences were not subtle. Sophia moved through the world on schedule, by design, in straight lines between objectives. Ethan moved through it by instinct, with a carpenter's habit of measuring twice before committing, and an architect's eye for the space between things. She found his ease in silence, unsettling the way he could sit in a room without filling it with words or movement, content to simply be present. He found her compulsive productivity almost poignant, the way she reached for her phone at the end of every meal, as though the moment food was finished, the respite was also finished. At a dinner with 2 board members early in the second week, he watched her deliver a 10-minute summary of the Pacific expansion proposal with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it in her sleep, and when she finished and the older of the 2 men made a condescending remark about her enthusiasm, Ethan looked at the man with a mild, pleasant expression and said, "She's not enthusiastic. She's right. There's a difference." The table went quiet. Sophia stared at him. The board member recalibrated his tone. It was the first time in longer than she could clearly remember that someone had defended her without being asked to, without any obvious stake in the outcome, without anything to gain. She didn't know quite what to do with that. She filed it under unexpected variables and moved on. But she thought about it later, alone in the quiet of her office at 11:30, in a way that did not feel entirely professional. Sophia was not accustomed to noticing people. She assessed them, categorized them, factored them into her planning, the way she factored in weather and market conditions as variables to be managed, rather than presences to be genuinely felt. But noticing the particular attentiveness that has nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with simple human interest was something she had set aside so long ago that she had nearly forgotten it was a capacity she possessed. Ethan Cole was causing her to remember. It started with small things. The way he thanked the restaurant staff by name, having apparently learned every name within 2 visits. The way he never spoke about himself without first listening to the person across from him, as though he genuinely believed other people's experiences were more interesting than the performance of his own. The way he kept a small photograph of Lily in his wallet, not on his phone, not digitally preserved, but printed and folded and carried the way people carry the things they are genuinely afraid of losing. She noticed that he never asked for anything beyond what the arrangement required. No upgrades, no requests, no exploratory suggestions about extending the contract or adjusting the terms in his favor. He occupied the space she had allocated him with a kind of considered dignity that she found, unexpectedly, moving. She began asking him questions. First, practical ones about his work, about his history with architecture, about why he had left a profession he had clearly loved. He answered these without self-pity, which she respected deeply. He had made choices, he said. The choices had costs. He was fine with the costs. She found herself pushing further than she had intended. She asked about his marriage. He told her the truth, that he and Claire had loved each other, and then, gradually and without drama, had stopped being the right people for each other, and that the only real casualty of the divorce was the time it cost him with Lily. He said this simply, without bitterness or performance, with the particular equanimity of a man who had already grieved what he needed to grieve, and had moved on to the business of living. There was no self-aggrandizement in it, no polished narrative designed to make him sound like a martyr or a saint. He was just telling the truth about what had happened, and she realized, sitting across from him, that she had been in rooms full of powerful people for 10 years, and had not heard anyone speak that plainly about something that had hurt them. She asked about Lily. He talked for 45 minutes. She listened to every word. This had not been part of the arrangement, she told herself. But there was something in his voice, when he talked about his daughter, a quality of undefended love, complete and unperforming, that she could not look away from. She had everything money could buy, and she had never spoken about anyone in her life with that particular quality of voice. She was beginning, cautiously, and with great resistance, to feel the shape of what she was missing. The nights were what changed things most, though Sophia would not have admitted this to anyone, and barely admitted it to herself. There had always been a long period between when she finished work and when she was finally able to sleep, hours that she spent at her desk or on the balcony with documents she wasn't truly reading, hours that had always felt like an unscheduled inconvenience, a gap in the programming of a day that was otherwise fully accounted for. With Ethan in the apartment, those hours became something else entirely. He had a habit of being awake late, not because he was working but because he was simply a night person. And he had the sociable introvert's gift for making a conversation feel like a choice rather than an obligation, like something that was happening because both people wanted it, rather than because the hour required company. They began talking in those late hours about cities and design, and what made a building feel alive versus merely functional, about the philosophy of space, and why certain rooms make people feel small and others make them feel held, about her father and his exacting expectations, the particular loneliness of growing up in a family where excellence was the baseline and warmth was occasional, about Ethan's childhood in a small town in Ohio, and the first building he ever saw that made him understand what architecture was for a public library in Columbus that he had visited at 12 years old on a school trip, with a reading room flooded by natural light and a ceiling that seemed to have been designed specifically to make the person beneath it feel the right size. She told him things she hadn't told anyone. Not because she decided to, not because she sat down and made a conscious choice to be vulnerable with this particular person, but because he had the unusual quality of listening without judgment and without collecting, and she found, with some alarm, that she had more to say than she had known. By the end of the 3rd week, She caught herself thinking about their conversations before they had happened, arranging her day so that the work was done and she was free by 9. She noticed this. She named it, to herself, with clinical precision, and then she told herself it was nothing more than the natural warmth that develops between two people sharing a living space. She was wrong, and she knew she was wrong, but knowing you are wrong and being willing to do something about it are entirely different acts, and Sophia Hart had spent a decade specializing in the former while avoiding the latter. The winter gala at the Whitmore estate was the evening that everything became undeniable. It was the kind of event where the guest list was a message and the decor was a performance. And every conversation happened on two levels simultaneously: the surface exchange and the subtext that actually mattered. Sophia had attended a dozen of these in as many years, always alone, always performing the self-possession that the room expected of her, always leaving before midnight with a drink barely touched and the specific tiredness of someone who has been watched for 3 hours straight. This time was different. Ethan had spent 20 minutes before they left negotiating with her about the car she wanted the driver. He wanted to walk 2 blocks in the November air because, he said, it was the only way to arrive anywhere feeling like yourself rather than like a performance, she had argued. He had simply kept walking. She had followed, in 4-inch heels, on a sidewalk lit gold by the street lamps. And by the time they reached the entrance she was, to her own considerable surprise, genuinely composed rather than merely performing composure. Inside, they moved through the room together in a way that felt nothing like performance. He knew when she needed to be saved from a conversation. And she knew, somehow, when he was uncomfortable, something she had no reason to know about a man she had met 6 weeks ago. When Douglas Fenn approached them with his calculating smile and his observation that they made quite a couple, she watched Ethan receive this with a polite nod and a dry comment about the canapes that made 2 nearby strangers laugh and left Fenn without purchase for further probing. She was aware, for the first time all evening, that she was smiling. Not performing a smile. Actually smiling, with the particular warmth that comes from being genuinely amused, genuinely at ease, genuinely beside a person she was glad was there. When the music began and Ethan extended his hand with the slightly self-deprecating expression of a man who was a decent but not exceptional dancer and knew it, she took it without deciding to. They danced badly and correctly, and she didn't care about the correctly part at all. Later, in the car home, she had won the car. This time, though she wasn't sure why, she looked out the window at the city sliding past and felt the specific weight of a feeling she had been successfully avoiding for 6 weeks. The room had believed they were real, and standing in that ballroom, with his hand at the small of her back and his voice low in her ear pointing out the man by the bar who was almost certainly wearing a toupee. She had believed it too. For just a moment, just long enough, things fell apart in the particular way that things fall apart for people who are just beginning to understand what they have, not with a single blow, but with several arriving in sequence, each one a little heavier than the last. The first blow came from within the board itself. A man named Richard Caldwell, who had spent the last 3 years positioning himself as an alternative to Sophia's leadership, had been quietly building a case against her. He had hired someone to look into Ethan's background, not out of genuine corporate concern, but out of the tactical instinct of a man who understood that the fastest way to destabilize a CEO was to make her personal life a liability. What Caldwell's investigator found was not hard to find. Because Sophia and Ethan had never intended to be scrutinized this closely. There was no long shared history, no mutual friends who could attest to a courtship, no trail of the small, ordinary evidence that accumulates between two people over years of actually knowing each other. There was only a very recent introduction and a very convenient timing, and Caldwell understood exactly what that meant. He brought what he had to 2 board members before bringing it to Sophia, which was the move of a man who wanted the information to do its damage before anyone had the chance to manage it. The rumors began on a Thursday. By Friday, a financial news outlet had published a piece that stopped well short of accusation, but leaned heavily on implication, describing the relationship between Hart Global's CEO and an unknown man of modest means as sudden and strategically timed, and quoting an anonymous source as saying the board had questions. The second blow fell on the same Friday afternoon, 3 hours after the article appeared, when Ethan received a call from Portland, Lily's condition had taken a complicated turn. The specialist was recommending a new procedure, faster than originally planned, more expensive. The number his ex-wife gave him, quietly and carefully, was one he had no way to reach without immediately liquidating the last asset he owned. A small property his parents had left him, the only thing he had kept from the life before. He spent that evening trying to reach a broker, and failing, sitting in the guest suite of a penthouse that was not his, wearing clothes that cost more than his monthly rent, feeling the specific indignity of a man who has traded his self-sufficiency for a paycheck and still cannot make the numbers work. Sophia found him like that, at 9:30, sitting at the desk by the window with the city laid out below him like an argument he wasn't winning. She had just finished a call with her communications team. She had the article open on her phone. She sat down across from him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. Then she asked him about Lily. He told her. She listened the way she always listened, with complete attention, with the kind of quiet that is not silence, but presence. And then she did something she had not done for any person in 10 years of holding power. She decided, entirely on her own terms, without being asked, to use it. By the following Monday morning, 3 things had happened that Ethan Cole did not know about and had not requested. The broker handling the sale of his parents' property had received a formal offer above asking price. Clean terms, no delays from a buyer whose name Ethan did not recognize. The specialist in Portland had received notification that Lily Cole's upcoming procedure would be covered by a medical grant from the Heart Foundation, a philanthropic arm of Heart Global that had, until very recently, focused exclusively on architectural preservation projects. And the law firm that represented Heart Global's interests had quietly placed a cease and desist with the financial outlet that had published the piece about Sophia, citing a specific and technical violation of sourcing ethics that Caldwell's team had, in their haste, failed to protect against. Sophia had done all of this in 48 hours, between board calls and press briefings, and the ongoing management of a company that employed thousands of people. She had done it without announcing it, without asking for anything in return, without the slightest performance of generosity. She had simply seen a problem and solved it, the way she solved every problem completely and without ceremony. When Ethan found out, he was angry. This surprised her. She had expected gratitude, or at least relief. Instead, he appeared in her office at 7 in the evening, with the expression of a man who had spent several hours deciding whether to say something, and had finally decided to say it. He told her this was not what they had agreed to. He told her he didn't need to be managed. He told her that the difference between helping someone and making decisions for them was a difference he took seriously, because it was the difference between being treated as a person and being treated as a project. His voice was even throughout all of this. He was not shouting. He was, in some ways, harder to hear because of it. Sophia listened to him with the same complete attention she always gave, and then she did something she almost never did. She told him the truth. Not the strategic truth, not the managed version, but the actual one, that she had not done it because the arrangement required it, or because her reputation needed it, or because the board was watching. She had done it because when he sat at that desk with the city below him and the weight of Lily's treatment on his face, she had felt something crack open in the place she had spent 10 years reinforcing. She had done it because she cared about what happened to him. And then, because the truth, once begun, is very difficult to stop, she told him the rest of it. She had fallen in love with him. She didn't know when. She didn't know how. She wasn't asking him to do anything about it. But she was done pretending she hadn't. Ethan left the following morning. He didn't slam doors or deliver speeches. He simply packed what was his, which was not very much, because very little of what surrounded him in the penthouse actually belonged to him, and he called a car, and he went back to his apartment, which still smelled like coffee and old wood, and the life he had lived before all of this. He sat in his kitchen for a long time, longer than he had sat still in months, and he looked at the walls he had painted himself, and the shelves he had built, and the mug on the counter that had a small chip in the handle that he had never gotten around to replacing. He thought about what Sophia had said. He thought about the gap between her world and his, the kind of gap that doesn't close with goodwill or chemistry, that requires one person to give up more than they should have to give, that tends to quietly hollow out even the best intentions over time. He told himself he was being practical. He told himself he was protecting himself and protecting her from a dynamic that couldn't sustain itself once the contract was over and the scenery was gone. He was, in some part of his mind, that he was keeping carefully quiet, also terrified. He had loved Claire and lost the version of himself that had built that love. The prospect of loving someone, again, especially someone as extraordinary and as defended and as genuinely difficult as Sophia Hart, was not simply appealing. It was frightening in the specific way that meaningful things are frightening. Because meaningful things can be taken from you. And he was a man who had already been through the taking. He threw himself back into work. He took on 2 new consulting projects and signed up for an evening drafting course he'd been postponing for a year. He called Lily every evening, and the calls were good. She was feeling better. The new procedure date was set. Her voice had the quality of a child who was on the right side of something difficult. He did not call Sophia. She did not call him. 2 weeks passed this way. Quiet and almost normal. Except for the particular quality of the quiet, which was not peace but the specific absence of something that had been present. Sophia, meanwhile, was not quietly enduring anything. She was fighting. Caldwell had moved faster than she anticipated, bringing his evidence to a full board session, and framing it not as personal interference, but as a question of corporate governance. Did the board have confidence in a CEO who had apparently staged a romantic relationship to manipulate shareholder sentiment? It was, she had to admit, a well-constructed attack. It had the technical precision of something that had been planned for months. And it had the additional advantage of containing enough truth to make denial complicated. She did not deny it. In the emergency board session, when Caldwell laid out his documentation and waited for her to deflect or diminish or manage the narrative, Sophia Hart did something that none of the people in that room had ever seen her do. She was honest. She told them that the arrangement had begun as a practical solution to a political problem of their own, creating that the board's obsession with her personal life had manufactured a situation in which she felt compelled to manufacture a solution. She told them that whatever the arrangement had begun as, it had become something real, and that something real had ended because she had made the mistake of caring about a person without first asking whether she was allowed to. She told them that she had run this company with integrity for 10 years and would continue to do so regardless of what they decided, and that if the deciding factor in their confidence was her personal life rather than her professional record, she would be happy to provide an itemized list of quarterly earnings, acquisition outcomes, and market positioning achievements for their review. She was, by the end of it, shaking very slightly, not with fear, with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has held something together by will alone for so long that she has forgotten what it feels like to set it down. The board voted. It was not unanimous, but it was enough. Ethan found out about the board session from a mutual contact, someone who had been in the room, and was sufficiently impressed by what he had witnessed to mention it to the architect consulting on his firm's new offices. He sat with this information for several hours. He thought about what it meant that Sophia had stood in front of a room full of people who held her professional future in their hands, and told them the truth, not the useful truth, not the managed truth, but the actual human, messy, uncomfortable truth about who she was, and what she felt, and what she had done. He thought about what that cost her, for a woman who had spent 10 years treating transparency as a vulnerability. He thought about the photograph of Lily in his wallet, and about the way Sophia had listened when he talked about her, and about all the small things he had cataloged without meaning, to the way she held her coffee cup with both hands in the morning before she was fully awake, the way she always said thank you to the building's night security guard, the way she had followed him 2 blocks in 4-inch heels on a November sidewalk because she trusted him enough to see where he was going. He thought about the crack in his wall that he had been patching for 3 years, and whether it was stronger for the patching or just more complicated. He called his daughter. Lily, who was 11 and clever and entirely her father's child in the way she understood things before she'd been given the words for them, asked him if he was okay. He said he was fine. She said, You sound like you're fine about something that isn't fine. He told her about Sophia. Not all of it, but enough. Lily listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and then she said, Dad, if you already know what the right thing is, you're just waiting to feel braver than you are. He sat with that for a moment. Then he got up and put on the charcoal blazer he'd had dry cleaned exactly once since a friend's wedding 3 years ago, and he went to find her. The shareholder meeting was held in Hart Global's main conference hall, a room that fit 200 people and was very nearly full. It was the quarterly review, rescheduled from the previous month. And it carried the additional weight of everything that had happened in the weeks since Caldwell's motion, the board vote, the press coverage, the ongoing debate about whether Sophia Hart was an asset or a liability to the company her father had built. She stood at the front of the room in a gray suit and no jewelry, and she had just begun her opening statement when the rear doors opened. Ethan Cole walked in. He was wearing the charcoal blazer. He had not been invited. He had simply come. Sophia saw him from the front of the room and went very still. He made his way to the front, past 200 people who turned to watch him, and he asked the room, with the particular directness of someone who has stopped caring about whether the timing is appropriate, to give him 3 minutes. There was a silence. Sophia, to the visible surprise of the people on either side of her, did not stop him. She stepped back slightly. He spoke for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. He did not talk about the contract. He did not talk about money or shareholder value or corporate governance. He talked about Sophia Hart, not the CEO, not the brand, not the strategic asset, but the person he had lived beside for 6 weeks and come to know with the accidental intimacy of people who share a space and cannot entirely avoid being themselves in front of each other. He talked about the night she had spent 2 hours on the phone with a junior employee who was having a personal crisis, and had afterward gone back to her desk without mentioning it to anyone. He talked about the way she had revised the Pacific expansion proposal 3 times because she was not satisfied with the environmental offset provisions, when the original version would have passed the board easily. He talked about the fact that she had done things for him and for his daughter that she had neither needed to do nor been asked to do, and had done them with the clean economy of someone who simply believed it was the right thing and had expected nothing in return except the privacy to have done it without being thanked. He said, "There are people in this room who have known Sophia Hart for longer than I have and know her less well than I do. I'm here because she told the truth to this board about something that cost her, and no one seems to have noticed that that is exactly what integrity looks like." He paused. He looked at her. "She is the best person I have met in a long time, and I would have told you sooner, but I was being a coward about it." The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something real has just happened in them. Sophia, who had not cried in a professional setting since her father's farewell dinner 12 years ago, looked at the back wall for exactly 4 seconds before she trusted herself to look at him. She looked at him. He was watching her with the steady, uncomplicated attention she had come to recognize as simply who he was. The vote, when it came, went in her favor by a wider margin than the first. Caldwell's motion was formally tabled. The Pacific expansion was greenlit. Hart Global moved forward the way it always had, with Sophia Hart at its center, uncompromising and exact and, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely, visibly glad to be there. It was a Saturday morning in late March. 6 months and several lifetimes after a stranger had signed a contract in an office he'd never been inside before, and a woman had told herself she had everything under control. Sophia was at the kitchen counter of her apartment, not the penthouse, which she had quietly begun thinking of as the stage set it had always been, but a smaller place 2 floors down that she had moved into at the beginning of the year, with windows that faced east and a kitchen that was actually usable and bookshelves that she had, somewhat inexplicably, built with her own hands from a flat-pack kit she'd found online. Following instructions she'd had to read 3 times before they made sense. The bookshelves were uneven. She was inordinately proud of them. Ethan was at the stove making eggs, which he did the way he did most things without drama or announcement, simply well. Lily was coming to visit for the first time that afternoon, on the train from Portland, newly discharged from the specialist's care and cleared for normal activity, and Sophia had spent the previous evening approximately as nervous as she had been before any board meeting of her career, which was information she had shared with no one. The apartment was clean and there were flowers on the table, and she had looked up what 11-year-old girls liked to eat and had subsequently purchased an amount of food that Ethan had assessed, with visible amusement, as enough for a full team of 11-year-olds. She was standing at the counter reading something on her laptop when Ethan set a plate of eggs beside her and then sat down across from her and placed a small box on the table. It was not wrapped. He was not on one knee. He said, with the directness that had unsettled and then disarmed, and then simply become her favorite quality in another person. I have been thinking about this for about 3 months. I wanted to wait until Lily was okay, because nothing else felt like the right time until she was. And I wanted to do it here, not somewhere expensive, because I think you've had enough of expensive for a while, and also because you built those bookshelves in this room, and I want to remember that when I think about this moment. She was looking at him. She was not looking at the box. He opened it. The ring inside was simple and deliberate, a single stone on a plain band, the kind of thing an architect chooses because he knows that good design is not about addition but about exactly the right amount. He said, I know you spent a long time not wanting this. I know you have reasons for that, and most of them are good reasons. I'm not asking you to stop being who you are, or to want things you don't want. I'm asking you to want this. With me. For real, this time. She did not say anything for several seconds. She was, for the first time in a decade, in a room where she had absolutely no idea what the strategic response was, and it turned out that not knowing felt nothing like she had expected. It felt like relief. She reached across the table and closed her hand over his. She said yes. He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it for a long moment, at the clean simplicity of it, at the fact that it fit perfectly, at the evidence that he had thought about her enough and correctly enough to know her size without asking, and she cried. Not the composed, managed tears of a woman performing emotion for an audience, but the actual kind, the kind that have been waiting long enough that when they arrive, they are not embarrassing but necessary. He didn't say anything. He handed her a paper towel, because he was practical like that, and she laughed through the crying, and the morning light came through the east-facing windows and lit up the uneven bookshelves and the plate of eggs and the ring on her hand. They walked out of the building together that afternoon to meet Lily's train. Through the lobby where the night security guard waved at them and called out morning, Miss Hart. And Sophia waved back and said his name. The city was doing what cities do in March, tentative and cold still, with the particular uncertain light of a season that hasn't committed yet. They walked down the sidewalk, not the building she had run for 10 years, not the penthouse that had been a backdrop for a performance, but the ordinary street with the coffee shop on the corner and the bookstore that was always slightly disorganized and the crosswalk where they had to wait because the light was red. They were not performing anything. They were not managing anything. They were two people who had found each other by accident, in circumstances neither of them would have designed, and had been honest enough and stubborn enough and afraid enough, and eventually brave enough to hold on to what was real. The contract had expired months ago. The role was over. Everything that was left was theirs. Lily's train arrived at 3:47. She was small and dark-eyed, and carried a backpack with a keychain of a tiny house on the zipper, and when she saw her father, she ran to him in the uncalculated way that children run when they are genuinely glad to see someone. He caught her, and held her the way he held the things he was afraid of losing, which was tightly and without apology. Then Lily looked at Sophia, who was standing slightly to the side in the way of someone who is trying to give a moment its room, and Lily said, with the directness she had inherited completely and entirely from her father, "You're Sophia." Sophia said yes. Lily said, "He talks about you the way he talks about good buildings." Sophia looked at Ethan. He was looking at the departures board, with the expression of a man who was trying very hard not to smile. Sophia said to Lily, "I'll take that." Lily nodded seriously, as though this had been a formal assessment, and Sophia had passed it, and took her father's hand, and the three of them walked out of the station together into the uncertain March light, not a CEO and a fiancé on contract. Not a story of leverage and arrangement and strategic theater. Just three people, one of whom was beginning to understand what a family was for, and two of whom had already known for a while, and all of whom were, finally and without reservation, exactly where they were supposed to be. And for Sophia Hart, the woman who had spent a decade believing that control was the same thing as safety, the most extraordinary thing about that afternoon in March was not the ring on her finger, or the vote she had won, or the empire she had kept. It was the simple, unscheduled fact of walking out of a building with nowhere in particular to be and no performance to give, into a cold and tentative spring, with two people she loved beside her and nothing left to manage.